20 years had passed since Emperor Valeth ordered the attack on the human mining outpost. The Emperor himself had died 8 years into the conflict, not from human weapons, but from a poison administered by his own advisors, who had finally realized that their leader had doomed their civilization. His death changed nothing. The Draven Empire that had once controlled 43 star systems now clung to 3 core worlds. Their economy shattered beyond recovery, and their military reduced to a defensive force that could barely protect their remaining territory. Humanity had not conquered them through overwhelming force or technological superiority. They had simply refused to stop for 20 years. Human intelligence agencies had mapped every aspect of Draven society. For 20 years, human diplomats had worked to isolate the Draven from potential allies. For 20 years, human economists had systematically dismantled Draven trade networks through legal means that could not be challenged in any galactic court. And for 20 years, human military forces had maintained constant pressure, never committing atrocities or targeting civilians, but always present, always watching, always waiting. The current Draven government had come to power through a revolution led by reformers who understood what their predecessors had refused to accept. There was only one way to end this. Chancellor Vareth stood before the human tribunal on the neutral station of Velorum Prime, surrounded by the 17 surviving individuals who had ordered or participated in the attack on asteroid KV-7 2 decades earlier. Some were ancient now. Their scales faded, and their bodies weakened by years of hiding. Others had been captured just months ago, after spending their entire adult lives running from human investigators. All of them would face justice. Admiral Quan Seojin, granddaughter of the legendary Admiral Quan Mai, presided over the tribunal with a face carved from stone. This court has been convened to address the deaths of 214 human citizens, she announced. The accused have been charged with crimes against humanity under the Universal Compact of Sentient Rights. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Evidence was presented meticulously, every order traced to its source, every participant identified and their role documented. The defense offered arguments of military necessity and sovereign authority, but the tribunal rejected them all. In the end, guilty verdicts were delivered. For all 17 defendants, sentences varied based on individual culpability, ranging from life imprisonment to execution for those who had given the final orders. Chancellor Vareth requested permission to address the court after the sentences were announced. On behalf of the Draven people, she said, her voice heavy with shame, I offer our deepest apologies for the actions of our former government, and I accept responsibility for the suffering our empire has caused. She bowed her head. We did not believe the warnings, she said. We thought ourselves too powerful to face consequences, too advanced to be challenged by a younger species, too proud to imagine that our actions could lead to our destruction. She looked up at Admiral Quan. We were wrong, she said, and we have paid for that error with everything we once possessed. Admiral Quan nodded, but offered no words of comfort. There was nothing to say. The tribunal concluded, and the prisoners were led away to serve their sentences at the Galactic Concord headquarters. Ambassador Seong Yuna stood before the assembled representatives one final time. She was 87 years old now, her hair white and her face lined with decades of service. But her eyes remained sharp, and her voice carried across the great chamber without faltering. 20 years ago, I stood in this chamber and made a promise, she said. I told the galaxy that humanity would pursue justice for the 214 people killed on asteroid KV-7. And I told them that we would not stop until accountability had been achieved. She paused and looked around at the faces watching her. That promise has been kept. The chamber was absolutely silent. I did not take pleasure in the suffering of the Draven people. Ambassador Seong continued. They are not evil, merely foolish. And they have paid a terrible price for the arrogance of their leaders. She activated a holographic display, showing the original warning broadcast from High Commander Vorath of the Velthari. The ancient alien's face appeared once more, his words echoing through the chamber. Do not attack the humans, because if you do, they will pursue you forever. Ambassador Siong let the recording finish before speaking again. We did not choose to be this way, she said. Our history taught us that the universe is not safe, that the weak are prey, and that the only way to protect our people is to make attacking them unthinkable. She looked directly at the representatives of species who had been considering expansion into human space. We do not want conflict, she said. We want peace, trade, cooperation, friendship, but we will not accept attacks on our civilians, and we will not negotiate with those who believe that human lives can be taken without consequence. She stepped back from the podium. This is my final address to the Galactic Concord, she said. I am retiring from diplomatic service, but the promise I made 20 years ago will outlive me, because it is not my promise alone. She smiled, and there was warmth in it despite everything. It is the promise of every human parent to their children, she said, that we will never stop protecting them, no matter how long it takes or what it costs. She bowed to the assembly and walked slowly from the chamber. In the observation gallery, Desik of the Karathi watched her go. He was a senior diplomat now, decades older than when he had first begun studying humanity, and he had spent those years ensuring that his species never gave humans a reason to see them as a threat. He turned to his young assistant. Add this session to the first contact protocols, he instructed, and make certain that every Karathi diplomat understands what happened here today. What should the summary say? Ambassador Desik considered the question carefully before answering. Under no circumstances initiate hostile action against human populations, he said. They will pursue you forever. The assistant recorded the instruction and followed Desik from the gallery behind them. The great chamber slowly emptied as representatives returned to their own worlds carrying the same lesson: humanity was not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the most advanced or the most numerous, but they were patient, and they were determined, and they never forgot. And that made them more dangerous than any empire that had ever risen or fallen among the stars. The warning had finally been understood. Emperor Valith of the Draven Empire sat upon his throne of polished obsidian and listened to his advisors argue about the human problem. The Draven had risen to prominence over the past century through aggressive expansion and ruthless efficiency, conquering 17 species and absorbing their territories into an empire that now spanned 43 star systems. They were feared throughout their region of space, and Emperor Valith intended to extend that fear even further. The human mining outpost in the disputed zone is an insult to our sovereignty, Admiral Korath declared, his scales flushing with anger. They extract resources from territory that rightfully belongs to the Empire. The territory is disputed precisely because no species has established a clear claim, Minister Thesara countered. Attacking the humans would invite complications we do not need. Complications, Admiral Korath scoffed. You speak of the warnings, the old stories about human persistence and determination, but those are tales told by weaklings who lost wars. Through their own incompetence, Emperor Valith raised one clawed hand, silencing the debate. Tell me about these warnings, he commanded. Minister Thesara stepped forward with obvious reluctance. There are records, Majesty, of species that attacked human civilians and faced prolonged campaigns of retaliation, she said. The Velthari Dominion, the Mandari Syndicate, the Jolian Collective, all of them underestimated human resolve and paid terrible prices. The Velthari were arrogant fools who overextended their empire, Admiral Korath interrupted. The Syndicate were criminals with no real military capability, and the Collective had been declining for centuries. But the Draven Empire is none of these things. He turned to face the Emperor directly. Humanity is a minor power, he said. They have fewer than 50 colony worlds and a fleet that could not challenge our naval strength in any meaningful engagement. So if we strike quickly and decisively, they will have no choice but to accept our territorial claims, Emperor Valeth considered the arguments carefully. He had built his empire through calculated aggression, knowing when to strike and when to hold back, and he did not make decisions based on fear or old stories. What do our intelligence services report about human military capability? He asked. Their technology is approximately equivalent to our own, Admiral Karath admitted, but their numbers are far inferior, and they lack the industrial capacity to sustain a prolonged conflict against our full military strength, and their reputation for persistence exaggerated, the Admiral said confidently. Every species we have conquered claimed to be more determined than their predecessors, and every one of them broke when faced with superior force. Emperor Valeth made his decision. Execute a surgical strike against the human mining outpost. He commanded, eliminate the installation and withdraw before their military can respond, and we will see how these legendary humans react to a display of Draven power. The attack was carried out 3 days later with brutal precision. 12 Draven warships emerged from faster-than-light travel directly above the mining outpost on asteroid KV-7, overwhelming the minimal defensive systems and destroying the facility within minutes. 214 human workers died in the assault. The Draven fleet withdrew immediately, leaving no evidence of their presence except the wreckage of the outpost and the bodies of the dead emperor. Valeth broadcast a message to humanity the following day. The mining installation in Sector KV-7 was operating in Draven territory. He announced, this enforcement action was regrettable but necessary, and we offer our condolences for the loss of life. He paused for effect before continuing. The Draven Empire has no desire for extended conflict with humanity, he said. We offer generous compensation for the families of those who died and propose immediate negotiations to establish clear territorial boundaries, because we believe this unfortunate incident can be resolved peacefully if both parties approach the situation with reason and pragmatism. He ended the transmission feeling confident that humanity would accept his terms. They were outmatched militarily and economically, and any rational species would recognize that cooperation was preferable to destruction. The human response came 3 days later. Ambassador Seong Yuna stood before the Galactic Concord, her face calm and her voice steady as she addressed the assembled representatives. The Draven Empire has killed 214 human citizens, she said. Workers, engineers, families who were doing nothing more threatening than mining ore in disputed territory. She paused and let the silence stretch. Emperor Valeth has offered compensation and negotiation. She continued, he believes that this matter can be resolved through diplomacy, and that humanity will accept reparations in exchange for peace. Several alien diplomats nodded, expecting the standard response. He is mistaken, Ambassador Seong said. The chamber went very still. Humanity does not accept compensation for murdered civilians, she said. We do not negotiate territorial claims established through violence, and we do not forget the names and faces of those who have been taken from us. She activated a holographic display showing the faces of all 214 dead workers. These are the people Emperor Valeth killed, she said. Their names will be remembered. Their deaths will be answered, and every individual who ordered or participated in this attack will face accountability. Is that a declaration of war? The Mandorian diplomat asked nervously. No, Ambassador Seong said. War implies a conflict with a defined end. Negotiations, treaties, compromises. But this is not war. She looked directly into the recording devices that would transmit her words across the galaxy. This is a promise, she said. The Draven can end this now by surrendering every individual responsible for ordering this attack. Or they can learn what the Volturi learned, what the Mendari learned, what every species in history has learned when they believed that killing humans had no consequences. She turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. Emperor Valeth believes that humanity will give up. She said, he believes that time and cost and difficulty will eventually break our resolve, but he is wrong, because humans do not forget, and we do not stop, and we will pursue justice for these 214 people for as long as it takes. The transmission ended on the Draven homeworld. Emperor Valeth watched the recording and laughed dramatic words. He said to his advisors, but words do not win wars, and humanity lacks the power to threaten the Draven Empire. He dismissed the human response as posturing and returned to the business of ruling his domain. He did not know that he had just made the worst mistake in Draven history, and by the time he understood the truth, it would be far too late. Thesek of the Karathi Diplomatic Corps had spent his entire career preparing for first contact scenarios, studying alien psychology, and learning to navigate the complex web of interspecies relations that define galactic civilization, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the puzzle that humanity represented. His assignment was simple in theory, merely to compile a comprehensive analysis of human behavior to guide his species as they expanded into regions of space where contact with humanity became increasingly likely. His superiors wanted to understand why the Karathi government treated this relatively young spacefaring species with such extreme caution. Thesek had expected to find evidence of military might or technological superiority that justified this wariness. Instead, he found something far more unsettling. The Galactic Archive on Station Velorum contained records stretching back thousands of years, documenting the rise and fall of empires and the interactions between countless species. Thesek began his research with the Velthari conflict, which was the most well-known example of human warfare. But he quickly realized that this was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern. The Mendari Syndicate had been a powerful criminal organization that controlled trade routes across 3 sectors 60 years ago. Their mistake had been raiding a human transport ship called the Wandering Star, killing the crew of 47 and stealing the cargo. The official records showed that the syndicate had offered to pay reparations, generous reparations that far exceeded the value of the ship and cargo. Humanity refused. What followed was not a war in any conventional sense. Human intelligence agency spent 15 years mapping every aspect of syndicate operations, identifying every member, tracking every credit, and documenting every crime. Then they shared that information with every species the syndicate had ever wronged. The Mendari Syndicate collapsed within 2 years. Not from human military action, but from the coordinated response of dozens of species who had finally received the evidence they needed to act. The last known syndicate leaders were captured 23 years after the original attack, found hiding on a remote moon where they had believed themselves safe. They were brought before a human court and sentenced for the deaths of 47 crew members. Thesek found similar patterns repeated throughout human history in space. The Jolian Collective had destroyed a human research station in a territorial dispute, killing 112 scientists. The collective spent 40 years trying to negotiate peace while humanity systematically dismantled their economic infrastructure through what appeared to be completely legal trade practices. By the time the collective finally agreed to human terms, they had lost 80% of their wealth and all of their political influence. The Ravishi hegemony had kidnapped human colonists to serve as slave labor in their mining operations. The hegemony no longer existed as a political entity, having fragmented into dozens of smaller states. After 3 generations of internal instability, that human historians attributed to unfortunate coincidences. Desik requested access to restricted files and found a term that galactic analysts had coined to describe human behavior, the pursuit doctrine. It was not an official policy, never written down in any human law or military manual, but it was understood by every human from childhood. If you attack our people, we will seek accountability, not revenge, not conquest, not extermination accountability, and we will pursue that accountability for as long as it takes. Regardless of cost or difficulty, Desik arranged a meeting with Park Suman, a human cultural attaché stationed on Valorum. Hoping to understand this doctrine from a human perspective, she was a small woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Nothing like the terrifying predators that Desik had begun to imagine. You want to know why we are the way we are, she said as they sat in a quiet cafe, overlooking the station's central garden. I want to understand, Desik admitted. Your species is not the strongest or the most advanced, yet you inspire fear in civilizations that have existed for millennia. Park Suman considered the question carefully before answering. How old is Karathi civilization? She asked. Approximately 12,000 years. And in that time, how many existential threats has your species faced? Desik thought about it. Perhaps 3 or 4 significant conflicts. Park Suman nodded. Human civilization is only about 10,000 years old, she said. And in that time, we have faced extinction countless times. Not from alien threats, but from ourselves, from disease, from climate, from the simple, brutal mathematics of survival. She took a sip of her tea. We learned very early that the universe does not care whether we live or die, she said. And we learned that the only way to survive was to make certain that attacking us was never worth the cost, but the resources you spend pursuing these conflicts, Desik said. The time, the energy. Surely it would be more efficient to simply accept losses and move forward. Park Suman smiled. But her eyes were sad. You are thinking like a species that has always been safe, she said. You have never known what it feels like to be prey, to look up at the stars and see only threats, to know that your children might be erased simply because someone stronger decided it was convenient. She leaned forward. We do not pursue accountability because we are vengeful, she said. We pursue it because we learned long ago that the only way to protect our people is to make attacking them unthinkable. And if that protection requires generations of effort, then we will spend generations, Park Suman said simply, because our children will inherit the safety we create, just as we inherited the debts of those who came before us. Desik left the meeting with a new understanding of humanity. They were not monsters or conquerors. They were survivors, shaped by a brutal history that had taught them one unshakable lesson. The only way to prevent future attacks was to ensure that every past attack had consequences, and they were willing to wait forever to prove that point when Desik returned to Karathi space. His report contained a single recommendation highlighted in red. Avoid hostile contact with humanity at all costs, because if the Karathi ever gave humans a reason to see them as a threat, the consequences would not end within any single lifetime. Captain Beek Jinho spent 3 weeks buried in classified archives, reading reports that had never been meant for public eyes. And with each passing day, his understanding of the Velthari conflict transformed into something far more unsettling than he had expected. The official history spoke of a war lasting 7 years. The classified records revealed a conflict that had never truly ended. It began on a spring morning on New Bizan, a thriving colony world home to 12,000 humans who had built a peaceful life among the stars. The Velthari fleet arrived without warning, emerging from faster-than-light travel directly above the main population center. They did not demand surrender or issue threats. They simply opened fire in 3 hours. New Bizan ceased to exist. The Velthari recorded the attack as a territorial enforcement action and expected humanity to respond the way every other species in galactic history had responded to overwhelming force. They expected negotiation, reparations, perhaps a strongly worded protest filed with the Galactic Concord. They expected humanity to accept its losses and move on. Captain Beak found the first sign of their miscalculation in a communication intercepted. Just 6 days after the attack, a Velthari intelligence officer had reported something strange happening across human space. Not military mobilization or fleet movements, but something far more subtle. Humans were talking to each other. Every colony, every station, every ship in the entire scattered diaspora of humanity was sharing the same images, the same names, the same stories of the 12,000 who had died on New Bizan. They were making sure that no one forgot. The Velthari dismissed this as primitive mourning rituals and continued their expansion, confident that humanity lacked the technology to pose any real threat. They were correct about the technology. They were catastrophically wrong about everything else. The first 5 years of the war went exactly as the Velthari predicted. Human fleets engaged Velthari forces and lost badly, and the casualty ratios were so lopsided that Velthari commanders began to question why humanity even bothered to fight. They captured human worlds and expected the survivors to submit instead. They found resistance that made no logical sense. Captain Beak read report after report of Velthari occupation forces, struggling to control populations that refused to be controlled. Human civilians would smile and cooperate, and then sabotage critical infrastructure. The moment guards turned away, human prisoners would spend years pretending to be broken before striking at exactly the right moment. Human children would memorize the faces of Velthari officers and pass that information to networks that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere. The Velthari declared victory 6 times during those first 5 years. Each time, humanity ignored the declaration and kept fighting. By year 7, the Velthari had begun to notice something disturbing. Their supply lines were failing with increasing frequency, not from military attacks, but from 1,000 small disruptions that seemed almost random. Ships would develop engine problems traced back to components manufactured in facilities that had been infiltrated years earlier. Officers would make decisions based on intelligence that turned out to be carefully crafted misinformation. The war they thought they had won was eating them from the inside. Captain Beak requested an interview with Admiral Quan Mai Ray, the legendary commander who had led the final human offensive against the Velthari. She was 93 years old now, her hair white as snow and her hands trembling with age. But her eyes remained sharp as she received him in her modest home on Earth. "You want to know how we won?" she said, before he could even ask his first question. "Yes, Admiral." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We did not win, Captain, because winning implies that the conflict ended at some point, and I am not certain it ever did." She gestured for him to sit and poured tea with hands that shook but never spilled. The Velthari believed that war was about territory and resources and military superiority, she said. They measured victory in star systems captured and fleets destroyed. But they never understood what they had started when they killed those 12,000 people on New Bizan. What did they start? Admiral Quan Mai Ray looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. They taught an entire species that they were not safe in the universe, she said. They taught human parents that their children could be erased without warning or reason. And they taught human children that monsters were real and wore purple scales and came from the stars. She set down her teacup. Every human who grew up during the Velthari conflict grew up with the names of the dead, she said. We did not let them become statistics and we did not let them be forgotten. And we raised an entire generation with a single, unshakable belief. What belief? That this could never be allowed to happen again, Admiral Kwan said. And that the only way to ensure it never happened again was to make the cost of attacking humanity so terrible that no species would ever consider it. She stood and walked to her window. Gazing out at the peaceful gardens beyond, the Volturi could have surrendered at any point, she said. We offered them terms, reasonable terms. Justice for New Bizen and guarantees of peace. But they refused to believe we would keep coming. And that was their mistake. How long did it take? Captain Beak asked. The classified records are incomplete. Admiral Kwan turned back to face him. The official war lasted 7 years, she said. The unofficial campaign continued for another 30. And we dismantled their empire piece by piece. Not through conquest, but through patience. She sat back down across from him. We did not seek to exterminate them, she said. We sought accountability, and we were willing to wait however long it took to achieve it. Because humans do not forget and humans do not stop. Captain Beak recorded everything, she said, and returned to his research station with a deeper understanding of what humanity had become during those terrible decades. The Velthri had attacked a minor species and expected a minor response. Instead, they had awakened something ancient in human nature, something that their civilization had never evolved to understand: the drive to protect, the refusal to forget, and the patience to pursue justice across generations. As he began to compile his report, Captain Beak wondered who else in the galaxy might be about to make the same fatal miscalculation, and he hoped, without much confidence, that the warning would reach them in time. The emergency transmission arrived at the Galactic Concord headquarters without warning, cutting through every secure channel and broadcasting on frequencies that should have been impossible to access. Ambassador Seong Yuna stood in the great circular chamber alongside 47 representatives from different spacefaring species, all of them staring at the massive holographic display that flickered to life in the center of the room. The face that appeared was Velthri, but barely recognizable as such. High Commander Varath had once been the most feared military leader in 3 sectors, his species renowned for their tactical brilliance and overwhelming firepower. But the creature on the screen looked nothing like the proud warrior from the historical records. His scales had faded from deep purple to a sickly gray, and his 4 eyes carried a weight that spoke of decades of suffering. This message is for every species in the known galaxy, Vorath began, his voice cracking with exhaustion. I speak to you not as a commander, but as a survivor. And I bring a warning that you must heed if you wish to avoid the fate of my people. The chamber fell absolutely silent. Do not attack the humans, Vorath continued. Do not raid their ships. Do not strike their colonies. Do not harm their civilians under any circumstances. And do not believe for a single moment that you can win a conflict against them through superior technology or numbers. A Mandorian diplomat laughed nervously, but the sound died quickly when Vorath's eyes seemed to stare directly through the transmission. The Volthuri Dominion once controlled 247 star systems, the High Commander said. We had the most advanced fleet in the quadrant, weapons that could crack planets, and soldiers who knew no fear. And when we attacked the human colony of New Bizen 40 years ago, we expected the conflict to last perhaps 6 months. He paused, and something terrible passed across his ancient face. We were so certain of our victory that we did not even bother to learn the name of the world we destroyed. Ambassador Seong felt her stomach tighten as she watched the recording, aware that every alien in the chamber was now glancing at her with new uncertainty. The humans did not surrender after we destroyed their fleet at the Battle of Proxima, Vara said. They did not surrender after we captured their outer colonies. And they did not surrender after we killed their leaders and burned their shipyards. because they do not surrender, and they do not forget, and they do not stop. The transmission flickered, revealing glimpses of data streams and battle records that scrolled too fast to read. "I am the last High Commander of the Velthari Dominion," Vorath said. "My species now numbers fewer than 8,000 individuals living on refugee ships at the edge of known space. And we have nothing left but this warning to offer the galaxy." His four eyes closed briefly before opening again with terrible clarity. "The humans will tell you that they are peaceful, and they will mean it, because they genuinely desire peace above all things. But if you harm their people, if you kill their civilians, if you give them a reason to see you as a threat to their existence, then you will learn what we learned." The chamber had grown so quiet that Sion could hear her own heartbeat. "They will come for you," Vorath said. "Not today, not tomorrow. Perhaps not even within your lifetime, but they will come. And they will keep coming until justice by their definition has been served. Because humans do not measure conflict in years or decades, but in generations. And their children will inherit the debts of their parents." The transmission began to break apart, static consuming the edges of the image. "This is my final act as High Commander," Vorath said. "To beg you, to plead with you, to warn you with every fiber of my being. Do not attack the humans, because if you do, they will pursue you forever." The hologram collapsed into darkness. Leaving the chamber in stunned silence, Ambassador Sion stood perfectly still as dozens of alien eyes turned toward her. Some curious, some fearful, and some openly skeptical propaganda. The Mandorian diplomat finally said, breaking the tension with a dismissive wave of his tentacles. "The Velthari lost a war, and now they wish to blame their defeat on human exceptionalism rather than their own failures." Several other representatives nodded in agreement, and the chamber began to buzz with conversation. Sion wanted to argue, wanted to explain that the Velthari warning should not be dismissed so easily. But her superiors on Earth had already sent instructions to downplay any narrative that painted humanity as dangerous or aggressive. She remained silent and watched as the Galactic Concord voted to archive the transmission as unverified foreign propaganda before moving on to more pressing matters. But she could not forget the look in High Commander Vorath's eyes, the absolute certainty of a being who had witnessed something that defied explanation 3,000 light years away, on a remote research station orbiting a dying star. Captain Big Jinho received a classified communication from Earth Command. He read the orders twice before setting down his tablet and staring out the viewport at the endless darkness of space. The request was simple on its surface, merely an assignment to compile a complete historical record of the Velthari conflict. But the timing troubled him deeply. That war had ended 30 years ago, and every official history had already been written and approved. Why would Earth Command suddenly want a new analysis? And why would they assign it to a military historian stationed at the edge of nowhere, rather than to the prestigious academics on Earth? Jinho pulled up the preliminary files and began to read, his frown deepening with each passing hour. The official records painted a picture of a defensive war, humanity responding to unprovoked aggression with measured force until the Velthari eventually sued for peace. But the classified files told a different story. They spoke of operations that lasted decades, of intelligence networks that spent generations infiltrating Velthari society, of a systematic and patient campaign that had continued long after the official ceasefire. They spoke of humanity's refusal to accept anything less than total accountability, regardless of how long it took or what it cost. Captain Beak closed the files and sat in the darkness of his quarters for a long time. He understood now why Earth Command wanted a new history written. Someone out there was about to make the same mistake the Velthari had made, and Earth wanted its people to remember exactly what that meant. The question was whether the warning would arrive in time, or whether another species was about to learn the hard way that humans never forgot and never stopped. And somewhere in the void between stars, the last ships of the Velthari Dominion drifted onward, carrying their terrible knowledge toward whatever refuge they could find. Their warning had been delivered. Now only time would tell if anyone would listen.